Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today we'll be discussing a case where a young boy went missing and was later found brutally murdered. Authorities had their sights set on the culprit from the very beginning, but with protocol seemingly thrown out the window, their investigation would soon be jeopardized. The case would then become stagnant for several decades until newly discovered evidence came to light. With renewed vigor, authorities now believe they're inching closer to tracking down this vicious killer. Today's case is about the murder of Gary Grant Jr. Gary Grant Jr. was 7 years old in 1984. He lived with his mother and two older sisters at the Arctic Acres Apartments, located in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Gary's mother, May, and his father, Gary Sr., were separated and had been for about a year as of January of '84. It's unclear what issues may have prompted the two to separate, but I don't think that really pertains to the story anyway. Regardless, Gary Sr. was a police officer working the midnight shift with the Atlantic City Police Department and had been for the past decade or so. During his free time, Gary Sr. also volunteered as a basketball coach for the Blessed Sacrament School of Margate. Now, Gary Jr. was described as good-natured, extroverted, and a born leader. He also really enjoyed singing and made friends with practically everyone. Reverend Brendan Meany of Our Lady Star of the Sea Church described Gary Jr. for the Herald News. He stated that Gary was a, quote, lovable little cherub, and also mentioned that, quote, the child was one who was incapable of any wrong, end quote. On Thursday, January 12th, 1984, 7-year-old Gary Jr. had the day off of school. Our Lady Star of the Sea School, where he was a second-grade student, was hosting teacher conferences that day, so classes were canceled. Now, on this day, Gary told his mother that he had a 2:30 appointment to get to that afternoon. Thinking that this was just a funny thing for a child to describe maybe a playdate as, she didn't probe too much more, but she did tell Unsolved Mysteries, quote, I was asking him with who, and he said it was a secret. So I thought, it's silly. He's a little boy, something to do maybe with his little girlfriend around the corner or something. So I kind of left it at that, end quote.
He seems like a little businessman.
Honestly. So I'm going to actually send you a picture of him so you can see, because that's exactly what I pictured him as. He's so adorable.
Oh yeah, well with this picture he's wearing a shirt and tie. He looks like a little businessman.
He does, isn't he so cute?
Yeah, he is.
So based on what I've read and been able to find myself regarding the weather on and around January 12th, 1984, it seems as though it may have snowed a little bit the day prior, so there could have been at least a half an inch of snow still on the ground when Gary headed out of the house that day, assuming it hadn't melted yet. It was still pretty cold on the 12th. So as Gary got ready to head out the door, he told his mother that he'd be sure to be back before dark, and she believed he would be as he'd never been late before. And remember, it's January in New Jersey, so if Gary's saying he'll be home before dark, that means he likely planned to come back around 4:30 or 4:45 as the sun set at about 4:55 that day. So Gary Jr. bolted out of the house around noontime that afternoon, wearing his black snow boots, blue jeans, and a gray ski jacket with fur around the collar. By the time 4:30 rolled around, May expected Gary to be home, but time continued to pass and Gary still didn't walk through the door. After about a half hour of waiting, May began to really worry about her son. She knew something had to be up, so she left the house to go search for him. After a little while of searching and asking neighbors if they'd seen the young boy, May finally caved and called Gary Sr. to let him know she couldn't find their son. She then reported Gary Jr. missing that same night. Gary Sr. was actually set to work his midnight shift that night, but he called out to spend that time searching. It's reported that he scoured the entire local area, including the boardwalk, local arcades, alleyways in the neighborhood, casinos, you name it, he searched it. But after hours and hours of looking, there was still no sign of Gary Jr. Until Saturday, January 14th, 1984, 2 days after Gary Jr. had been reported missing, when a man who owned a warehouse located on North Carolina Ave in Atlantic City found the young child's body. Come to find out, the man who found him was actually the commissioner of the State Department of Environmental Protection at the time. It's reported that he'd heard about the searches for Gary Jr. going on in the area and decided to come assist. According to the Unsolved Mysteries episode on this case, pretty much as soon as authorities responded to the scene where Gary Jr.'s body was located, Gary Sr. was driving by that exact location and spotted all the police cruisers, so he stopped to see what was going on. And that's when he was told that his son was just found dead.
What was the location again?
So it was like a warehouse, like open vacant lot. There were like a bunch of warehouses around it. And I was literally just about to say too, it's like kind of a relatively residential area, but there were still like some businesses and stuff like that around.
Okay. Atlantic City is like a tourist attraction. A lot of people come spend vacation there. A lot of people in and out. A lot of gambling done in that area.
Yeah, they're still like in a more like neighborhood area though. Like even though it's Atlantic City, it's not like the hubbub area, you know, it's like residential.
Okay.
So like I just said, it's reported that the area where Gary Jr.'s body was found was in a relatively residential area, but he had been pretty well hidden beneath overgrown weeds in this vacant lot where the warehouse that the commissioner owned was located. And that lot was actually only about 2 blocks away from where Gary Jr. lived in the Arctic Acres apartment complex, which is pretty surprising that he'd been that close to home and all these people were out searching for him for hours on end, yet his body wasn't found for almost 2 full days since he'd been last seen. But regardless, after Gary Jr.'s body was discovered, it was determined that he'd been beaten in the head repeatedly with a blunt object, and his body had been covered with a carpet. Now, the scene itself was described as horrific, and it certainly seemed passion-fueled, at least to me. It's reported that not only blood had been spattered all over the weeds surrounding where Gary Jr.'s body was discovered, but so were parts of his skull. From the get-go, in my opinion, that seems to suggest that Gary Jr. was killed in this particular spot. And this fact is actually later confirmed by Captain Barber of the Atlantic City PD. After an autopsy was completed, the ME determined that Gary Jr. was in fact killed that Thursday night that he hadn't come home for dinner. He also determined that at a minimum, Gary Jr. was killed 24 hours prior to when his body was discovered. But the ME did say that the time of death was a bit more difficult to nail down because of the weather. It seems as though it was pretty raw outside the day Gary's body was found, you know, like that super freezing cold, rainy, wet type of weather. Now, it's also revealed later that authorities were able to locate what's believed to be the murder weapon in the same vacant lot where Gary's body was discovered. One of the investigators at the time, William McIntyre, gave a pretty good rundown of what investigators found at the scene to the Asbury Park Press. The article stated the following, quote, McIntyre described the condition of young Grant as badly beaten on the head, with purplish choke marks on his throat and an obvious, very large skull fracture on his forehead. The boy was fully dressed, wearing mittens and boots that poked out partially from beneath the carpet covering him. The boy's eyes were partially open, the detective said. McIntyre said a foot-long piece of pipe nearby appeared to be the murder weapon, a fact he said was supported during an autopsy 2 hours later, end quote.
Currently, I'm feeling like this could have been a crime of opportunity.
Okay.
I think that he could have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, with some shady character hanging around.
Mm-hmm.
This guy, or a person, ended up attacking him, maybe tried to choke him, but he continued to struggle, and then beat him over the head with the metal pipe.
So are you not considering the 2:30 appointment as something that could potentially be worked into this? Because I feel like that is something so strange for a 7-year-old to say and then have this happen. Was this a meeting that was already planned and then something went wrong? Or is it like maybe a red herring and it doesn't really mean anything and it was just a weird coincidence?
I would want more evidence to link the two together. 2:30 is the middle of the afternoon.
Yeah.
It's still light out. Unless he met up with this person and they did whatever for a couple hours and then ended up in the location where the murder occurred. I'm also thinking that if the murder weapon, the pipe, is a foot long, I'm thinking that it would have to be somebody relatively strong to cause a skull fracture with it. When you think of a weapon that's relatively short, it's a metal pipe, there's not a lot of velocity coming from like the length of the weapon. Whereas say you have, you know, a 3-foot long piece of pipe. A smaller person can get more leverage on that to cause damage. Whereas when you have a short piece of pipe, you got to think that it must be somebody that can put a little bit more force behind it.
Interesting. Okay. That's a good way to look at it.
So I'm thinking that this could have been done by an adult.
Okay. Gary Grant Jr.'s murder affected the entire town and especially had an impact on the children he'd attended school with. The Courier-Post reported, quote, "When the kids came in on Monday, everybody knew about Gary. There was a hushed silence in the hallways. Usually there's a hubbub. The kids didn't know how to handle what had happened. Everybody had a story to tell about Gary," end quote. I think it's pretty clear that this was an absolutely vicious crime perpetrated on such a young child, and authorities wanted to make an arrest as soon as possible. And as soon as investigators began canvassing the neighborhood and questioning anyone that might have had information or know what happened, they actually felt like they had found the person responsible almost immediately. Literally within hours of finding Gary Jr.'s remains, a 12-year-old boy had actually been brought in for questioning. That young boy's name was Carl Mason, but he went by the nickname Boo, which I'll call him throughout the rest of the episode so you don't get confused with the switching up of names. Boo was a 6th grade student who attended Brighton Avenue Elementary School, which, if you're curious, was located only about 2 miles or a 9-minute drive from where Gary Jr. lived, and about a 1.5 miles or a 6-minute drive from where Gary attended school. Boo was brought in for questioning, and I kid you not, within 24 hours of when Gary Jr.'s brutally beaten body was found, Boo Mason was arrested and charged with his murder. In the very early days of reporting on this case, though, Boo's name was actually not allowed to be released publicly because of his age. But, of course, there were a couple articles I found that did still state his name, even though reporters were instructed not to release said information. At this point, I'm sure you're wondering exactly why Boo was arrested and charged so quickly. Let's back up a little bit and discuss what happened during police's questioning of Boo and what prompted them to arrest and charge him.
I'm assuming or I'm guessing that perhaps he was in possession of one of Gary Jr.'s belongings.
Okay.
But if you were to ask me if I'm going along with this idea that Boo is the one that committed the crime, I would say no, just to go back to what you had said with, this 2:30 appointment. Makes me think back to Amy Mahalovic.
Yeah.
And how she was going to go with a special friend to go get the gift. This, elusive mystery person that a young child doesn't want to tell their parent about or doesn't want to tell their friends about potentially may be that, or they may be holding them in that, mystery sense because they don't want to say it's an adult that they're meeting up with.
Yeah.
Because it might be looked on
poorly. Or, yeah.
So I don't know how I feel about Boo being the one responsible at this point.
All right, well, let's keep going. In the very early morning hours of Sunday, January 15th, sometime between roughly midnight and 1 a.m., Boo Mason was brought in for an interview. And remember, this kid is literally 12 years old. He's probably going to be exhausted and confused as to what's going on. Well, during authorities' interrogation of Boo, they began to feel as though he was, quote, incriminating himself. And I guess some of the things he was saying made investigators feel like only the person who killed Gary Jr. would have known them. One of the investigators on the case later told the Asbury Park Press about one of those pieces of information that led investigators to believe Boo was their culprit. The article stated, quote, Prendergast said the boy knew unpublicized details of the crime, including a description of how the body had been left under a piece of carpet, end quote. Now, apparently, at one point during this interview, Boo ended up admitting to authorities that he hit Gary Jr. with a pipe, which, remember, was the murder weapon found at the scene. And then he also told them that he'd covered Gary's body with a rug, which again is something that detectives stated was unpublicized at the time. However, it seems as though a lot of the other details Boo provided to investigators was kind of fuzzy and muddled and didn't really provide them with a clear-cut explanation of what took place. At least I don't think anyway. But at several points during the interview, Boo retracted those statements, and even his confession as a whole. But even with the retraction, the young boy still ended up signing a statement, aka his written confession, and then authorities went on to arrest him and charge him for the murder of Gary Grant Jr.
Where are his parents, his lawyers, whatever? He can't be interviewed by himself.
He was.
Yeah, okay, come on.
So I was going to talk about this later, but it's not a big deal now. But his grandmother supposedly refused to sit in the interview.
So you can't do it. You need a guardian in there. They can't consent.
Yeah, I don't know. It's
If that would ever go to trial, they would get thrown out.
Well, We'll see.
Okay.
Now, when Boo was charged, those charges were classified as murder under the state of New Jersey's juvenile delinquency statute. And at first, authorities even wanted to try to charge him as an adult. But back in 1984, New Jersey law prohibited that. Any child under the age of 14 was not able to be charged or tried as an adult. However, it was reported that if Boo was convicted, he would be the youngest person ever in Atlantic City, New Jersey history to be charged and subsequently convicted of murder. So now that Boo had been charged, he was taken into custody and transported to a juvenile detention facility that same day, January 15th. His arraignment was scheduled for the following business day, which would be Monday, January 16th, 1984. Now, as soon as the information regarding an arrest in Gary Grant Jr.'s murder case reached reporters, they were all over it. There were tons and tons of articles in countless newspapers that reported on what was taking place in the case. At this stage, authorities told the press that they'd, quote, piece together what they believed to have taken place that night between Boo and Gary Jr., but were still working on, quote, tidying up loose ends, end quote. But honestly, overall, it appeared as though investigators were pretty dang confident in what they theorized to have happened, and it also seemed like they had an idea on what the motive for the murder may have been. But that information wasn't stated publicly by investigators. But then there's something very interesting that was being reported on pretty much simultaneously, and that was what individuals in the neighborhood and local area felt about the speedy arrest in this case, and even more specifically, what people thought of Boo Mason. Many individuals stated that Boo was, quote, scared of his own shadow, and believed that there was literally no way he could have done this. The entire area was absolutely stunned when the news of the arrest was made public, even though Boo's name wasn't discussed in the newspapers. All the locals knew that it was him that was taken into custody. And something else that was mentioned and also discussed in the Unsolved Mysteries episode on this case was that Boo was a small kid. And even though he was 5 years older than Gary Jr., he was actually smaller than him.
Did he get the name Boo because he was easily frightened?
That would be a really good nickname for that. I mean, I didn't think of it that way, but probably.
I mean, I think about like all the nicknames my dad used to say that people were named.
Yeah.
Like back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and stuff. And they always had like a weird reason that they were called that.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, knowing that he's like afraid of his own shadow.
That would make perfect sense. That's probably why. So reporters interviewed locals, and one neighbor told the Central New Jersey Home News, quote, most people I talk to don't believe the 12-year-old boy did it. The way the boy was so brutally beaten, it's hard to believe a child did it, end quote. Boo's lawyer also later spoke regarding the fact that he was unsure if Boo would have even been able to carry out such a brutal attack, considering the child's physicality. Just hearing these things about Boo and his personality might make you believe that he couldn't have killed Gary Jr., and it kind of seems like that's what everyone else thought too, except for investigators. So then that makes me think that there's got to be something else that authorities know that maybe the public didn't, because why would they be so dead set on Boo being their perpetrator? Well, there was an article in the Courier-Post that discussed something that May, Gary's mother, had said. She stated, quote, he was not allowed with that boy, end quote, meaning Gary wasn't allowed around Boo Mason. But it's not really clear why he wouldn't have been allowed to spend time with Boo, and it could have been, as simple as his age, or maybe something happened between the two kids, who knows. But then, in the Unsolved Mysteries episode later aired on this case, it stated that Boo and Gary were friends. So I'm not really sure what the relationship was there, but to me, it seems like there's a missing puzzle piece that maybe investigators and the family only knew.
Maybe there was some type of, negative air around Boo. You said that his grandmother refused to sit in on his interview.
Yep.
So I assume that his parents aren't in the picture.
Did not seem that way, no.
So he's staying with his grandmother. Who knows what the reasoning behind that is?
Mm-hmm.
There might be tension between the two of them. Obviously, if she's not willing enough to sit in on an interview to look out for him, probably not a good home life.
That's exactly what I was thinking, yeah.
Maybe that's why Junior wasn't allowed to be with Boo, because of whatever, the neighborhood thought of his family. It was like, no, that's a bad family. You can't be with that guy because maybe whatever, his parents were into some shit and the grandmother didn't really care and something like that.
Yeah, and who knows, Gary Sr. was a police officer. Was he privy to information that maybe, other families weren't, but he had told his wife, and his wife's like, no, I don't want you around that family.
Exactly. Mother and father could have been involved and arrested for whatever.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why the grandmother was taking care of him.
Yeah, definitely
So,
possible.
They could have known, like you said, some inside information that other people didn't.
Yeah. But with all that being said, let's get back to Boo's scheduled arraignment and subsequent hearing that was about to take place. So we know the arraignment took place on the 16th, and after that, the first hearing was scheduled. That first hearing was to determine if there was probable cause that Boo could have committed the murder of Gary Grant Jr. Judge John Himmelberger Jr. scheduled that probable cause hearing for January 24th, 1984. Now, some very interesting information came to light during this hearing and subsequent others. So, first of all, it's reported that Boo was in fact brought in for questioning on the 15th of January. That we already knew. And as I mentioned before, he was a young kid. He was probably exhausted. Well, allegedly during said questioning, authorities told Boo that if he told them the truth about what happened, and more so, told them what they were looking to hear, that he'd be able to sleep. The Asbury Park Press reported on what Boo's defense attorney said regarding the police's questioning of Boo. The article stated, quote, "Lavolsey said the boy had been awakened by police, taken into custody, and interrogated for more than 5 hours without sleep, without water, without food," end quote.
Like I said, this isn't going to hold up.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like anybody was following protocol here.
No, I mean, if the grandmother wasn't willing to sit down on the interview, you have to have some other type of unbiased witness or party there that can, bear witness to the interrogation.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because you think of like Making a Murderer with Stephen Avery's nephew.
Absolutely, yep.
Stuff like that where, they'll mess with people's heads when, they're under extreme circumstances, or in Brendan Dassey's case, maybe on the lower end of intelligence, and they'll tell you whatever they want in order to get the
answer
that they're looking for, even if it's violating your rights.
Yeah.
And when nobody's there to say anything about it, they can do what they want.
Yeah, but then you have to consider, why run that risk of going forward with this interrogation and making him sign this statement? How can he consent? He's just 12. All of these things don't really make sense to me. Why you would just throw that out the window and say, we're just going to do this and hope it sticks.
It's like what you just said, throw it at the wall and see what sticks. It's bad, but it's kind of along the lines of, beg for forgiveness instead of asking permission.
Yeah.
You do it, you're like, oh, this kid said this. He said that he beat him. He said that, all this information. He covered him with a carpet. Mm-hmm. We didn't release any of that information publicly. Mm-hmm. How did he know it? Mm-hmm. And because he has no witness, probably not recorded.
Yeah. I just think it's all well and good to try and throw shit out the wall or ask for forgiveness later, but not in a crime where there's a 7-year-old boy dead.
No, but I'm thinking, if you look at it from the grand scheme of things, if they can find the quote person responsible and put them away, if you can make everybody believe that, then it's like, okay, we have some closure here for the family. I'm not saying that that's good.
Yeah.
I'm saying if you're looking at it from that perspective, say Boo wasn't a 12-year-old kid, say it was some, 40-year-old bum that they were trying to pin it on. If they can pin it on somebody, then it's closure for the family and people feel, at ease.
Yeah.
Going back to Boo's family, if he came from a broken home and he had nobody that cared about him, they could have seen him as an easy target because nobody's going to defend this kid.
Yeah.
Maybe mom and dad are bad people, grandmother doesn't care about him. He had whatever going on in his life, so he's an easy target to try and pin it on. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. It just pisses me off. So.
Well, right. I mean, of course, it's terrible that it happened.
Yeah.
Luckily, it seems as though it's not going to go anywhere. But if this were to happen to another 12-year-old that had, a good family life, it would have been stopped in its tracks.
Yeah.
They probably wouldn't have been pulled out of bed at midnight and interrogated for 5 hours with no water, no sleep.
Yeah.
Why do you need to pull a 12-year-old out of bed at midnight? Why can't you do it in the morning?
Yeah, bring him in the next day. You're trying to get him when he's vulnerable.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Boo's attorney also stated that investigators during the interrogation, quote, badgered Boo into signing the confession statement. Basically, at this point anyway, it seemed like authorities may have coerced Boo into confessing, and it might not have actually been truthful or, best case, fully truthful, kind of like we were just talking about. Boo's attorney seemed awfully fired up about the confession in general, though, especially during the first hearing, which, like I mentioned, was just to determine probable cause. So the judge was like, dude, you gotta settle down here. He told him, quote, "There are plenty of safeguards in the system to be sure that confessions that are improperly obtained can be weeded out," end quote. He also stated, regarding what the hearing that day was for, quote, "This is not a determination of ultimate guilt or innocence," end quote.
Right, but if it's to establish probable cause, good on that lawyer for being fired up about it, because if you can quash it then, you don't have to have any other safeguards. It's like, hey, there was no PC for this arrest.
Yeah.
Get rid of the charges and dismiss it now.
Yeah, well, the judge said, no, that's not the point. The point is just to say, like, could he have done this? Technically, yes.
Well, you need probable cause for an arrest. Was there PC? This is to establish PC. And if he's trying to say there was no probable cause for them to pull him in the first place, why did they even go to him and start interviewing him?
Yeah.
Because where was the evidence that brought them to him in the first place?
Yep.
And then during the interrogation, if he was badgered, if he was, held under
duress,
for 5 hours as they interrogated him and badgered him into this confession, where is the probable cause?
Allegedly. That's the thing. Right now, it's he said, she said. Or he said, whatever, like between the attorney and the investigators. So at this point, it's not like, this is just an arraignment, essentially. And then...
Well, no, the arraignment already occurred. So essentially, he got charged. He got brought in on Sunday.
Yeah.
He got charged. He probably got held, I would assume.
Correct.
Overnight, because it was the next day he was going to be arraigned on a Monday morning.
Yes.
You go in front of a judge. The judge says, hey, you're being charged with murder. These are your parameters for your bail if you're getting bail. You have to be of good behavior. You can't leave the state, this, that, and the other thing.
Yeah.
And then he gives you your further court dates.
Okay, which he did, which was January 24th, which is this first hearing. Then.
Exactly,
so
the probable cause hearing. Yep.
Okay, all right. So then the next hearing date was set for February 15th, 1984. And this time, that hearing was to determine the admissibility of Boo's signed confession after the information about alleged coercion came up in the first hearing. If the confession was deemed admissible and if there was enough evidence to do so, the case would be taken to trial, which was set for March 13th, 1984. So about a month after this hearing.
So based on the second hearing, regarding the signed confession to see if it was admissible, the judge must have believed there was enough probable cause here for an arrest.
He must have, yes.
Because he could have dismissed the charges there and wouldn't have gone anywhere else.
Correct. It seems as though there was some sort of probable cause, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit later.
All right.
So I'd mentioned before that Boo's name wasn't released publicly, and it's later reported that another reason for this was not only because of the whole he was a juvenile thing, but because reporters were given access to cover a juvenile court case, which totally wasn't common at the time, they had to promise not to use his name. And like I said before, there were still articles that I found from back in '84 that released it, which kind of just seems like a shitty thing to do in my opinion, but... Anyway, back to the admissibility of Boo's confession. So far, just based on what we know already, it seems like this might get thrown out, considering if the information the defense attorney brought to light was true. Not letting the boy sleep, allegedly tormenting him into confessing. I mean, we've already said it 1,400 times so far. It didn't look good from the start. So there were 4 days of testimony regarding the confession's admissibility. During the hearing, it's reported that another child, who was described as a, quote, witness, had allegedly told Boo details of what took place and possibly even how Gary Jr. was killed that Boo then supposedly later used in his confession that he gave to police. This already sounds absolutely wild to me that some other witness would even know these things and not be looked into as a suspect. But I will say that it did seem like there were a lot of rumors and talk going on around town, and honestly, it's not really clear if someone knew the truth or some semblance of the truth, and then it made its way into the rumor mill, and then Boo somehow found out and used it in his confession.
Well, if you think when Gary Sr. was driving by where his son was found murdered,
yep,
surrounded by police cars, probably news outlets.
Yeah.
Do any of those people that saw that or were privy to that information, did they have kids? Were they talking to their spouse about it later in the night? Did their child hear it and then tell Boo?
Yes, exactly. So This witness was questioned during the hearing, and it's reported in an article with the news that, quote, the witness said he saw the defendant after the body was found and asked if he'd heard about Grant's death, end quote. So I don't know, that kind of seems to me like this witness talked to Boo sometime between when Gary's body was found and then when Boo was arrested.
Right.
So there still was time in between for him to say something.
Yes. So what I'm thinking is Boo must have heard from this other witness what happened.
Mm-hmm.
He alluded to the fact or divulged that he knew that during his interrogation,
mm-hmm.
and then police manifested that into, well, you're the one that did it, didn't you?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's what it seems
and then,
like.
So, yes, because he knew a little bit about what happened
Yep.
and said that, then police kind of just molded into what they wanted and said, it was you.
Exactly,
Which
yeah.
is kind of Brendan Dassey type thing.
Oh, absolutely. It feels just like it.
Right.
And I think at the end of the day, it just lends credence to this confession not being genuine.
Right. And with the judge talking about safeguards,
Mm-hmm.
there are safeguards before even being charged. In an interrogation, there are safeguards, and those
Yep.
safeguards were bypassed.
Agreed.
So,
Yep.
Don't give me that bullshit.
Well, during the testimony, it's also found that Boo was denied sleep during the interrogation, and authorities also supposedly waited too long to read him his Miranda rights.
Oops. That's like immediate. So, with Miranda rights, a lot of people think that when you're arrested, you have to be read your Miranda rights.
Because that's what every show on the fucking planet shows you.
Right. Well, when you think about it, say like on Cops,
Yeah.
a lot of times they're going to read your Miranda rights
Mhm.
because they want to ask you about the crime.
Yeah.
And if you're being asked about the crime that you're being charged with, you have to know your rights.
Mm-hmm.
But if you arrest somebody, tell them what they're charged with, and then bring them back to the station, process them, and do everything there,
Yeah.
they don't have to be Mirandized. You're not interrogating them based on the crime.
Yes.
Once you're being asked about the crime, that's when you need to have your Miranda rights read to you.
Okay, interesting. Well, from what I've gathered, it seems as though his rights weren't read to him until after he'd confessed.
Oops.
Big problem. But investigators also, during the hearing, testified that Boo did admit to hitting Gary and covering him with the carpet, which, remember, they were so dead set on this being indicative of him knowing things only the killer would have known, which has kind of already been thrown out the window by that other witness now. But then they also admitted in their testimony that Boo did retract his statements several times during their questioning of him. So just based on this, I mean, it honestly does not look good for investigators or the prosecution in terms of the admissibility of this confession, and it just feels like it's getting worse as time goes on.
Okay, so they have the murder weapon.
Correct.
I know it was cold, and maybe if Boo was the one that did this,
Mm-hmm.
he could have been wearing gloves.
Yep.
But where's the DNA on the murder weapon that links Boo to the crime? Where's the blood spatter on Boo's
Clothing.
clothes or whatever
Mhm.
that links him to Gary Jr.'s death? What evidence was found at that crime scene to lead them to him in the first place?
Nothing. I'll tell you right now,
Exactly.
it's nothing.
Exactly, which goes back to my previous question. Why did they go to this kid? Why was he the one interrogated?
Pretty much because people in town said that they had seen Boo and Gary together the day that he was killed.
Well, to go back to this mysterious, elusive thing,
Mm-hmm.
if May, Junior's mother, said that he's not allowed to be with that boy,
Mm-hmm.
that could have been another reason why he was hiding it from his mother. They could have been good friends
Very true, yeah.
and said, oh, I have an appointment at 2:30 with somebody.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to tell you who because
Right,
I'm not
because-
supposed to hang out with him.
Exactly. If he said boo,
Yeah, his
then
mom
she'd be
would
like,
have
you
been
ain't going
hell
out.
no. Yep.
Right, you're staying in the fucking house. So
Yep. Yeah, that would make sense, but
it could definitely put the two together.
yeah. So far through this, we've talked about how this has a lot of similarities to Brendan Dassey in Making a Murderer. Well, there's one other similarity. Boo had an IQ of 65.
Doesn't surprise me.
You add everything else we've talked about on top of the fact that this kid probably did not have the capacity to even understand what was happening to him, and knowing that like what he was saying could be used against him, and the fact that he's supposedly not read his rights until after he'd already confessed to this. How is he ever going to know? He wouldn't. And he's got no guardian. He's completely alone.
Right, like when I just said I'm not surprised that he has a low IQ,
Mhm.
I'm thinking this kid's the perfect target, comes from a potentially broken home, low IQ, we can pretty much...
Railroad him into a confession and
Right.
close our case in 24 hours.
Right, and also take the average 12-year-old
Mm-hmm.
tell them they're being charged with a crime and read them their Miranda rights with nobody giving them guidance, are they going to know what the fuck that means?
No. And an average kid at that, like
That's
a
what
child.
I'm saying, an average 12-year-old.
Yeah. But now you add the low IQ and the fact that he's not able to grasp this or understand it. He's probably looking straight through you as you're reading those Miranda rights. He doesn't know what the hell they mean.
Right.
So it's just, oh my God, it just very frustrating.
Yes, I totally agree with you. And even if, it was a high IQ 12-year-old, they might not grasp the gravity of what it means to be like, hey, you cannot say anything. You can ask for an attorney. You can talk to us, whatever. You can tell us what you want.
Well, because cops can lie to you and they can act.
Well, they can't lie in the Miranda rights. Like they have to lay out.
No, but like the cops can say these Miranda rights to him, and then he can be like, "Oh, but listen, buddy, like I'm your friend, like I'm here to help you."
Yeah.
Like they can totally change the way they're acting around him. And sure, those rights have been read, but now he's like with you face to face in person. You're being a nice guy to him. Like he's probably going to feel comfortable. He's probably not thinking about those rights right now.
Yeah. I think that what I was trying to get at is young kids don't understand the gravity of being charged with a crime and going to prison forever.
Absolutely not. No. And think about this, too. Go back to the fact that they were considering charging this kid as an adult.
Right. He would have been in prison forever. He probably would have gotten a 50-year sentence.
Yeah, isn't that absolutely wild, though? Just to think, like, as you add on all these things and then you find out that he mentally cannot understand this, like, never mind as just a 12-year-old, but with, this handicap.
Yeah.
It just seems, it's like, why wasn't this thrown out immediately?
Right. It's the perfect target to be like, oh, people saw you with him the day he died.
Must be you.
Now we can essentially pigeonhole you into giving a confession and put you away for it.
Yeah.
While somebody that really did it is still free.
Absolutely. Yeah. So,
assuming that Boo didn't do it, but I'm pretty sure he didn't.
It doesn't feel like he did. But on February 23rd, 1984, Judge Himmelberger finally had his ruling. And that ruling, of course, was that the confession was not admissible in court. The Central New Jersey Home News reported what Himmelberger had said of the ruling, stating that, quote, investigators trampled on the constitutional rights of this juvenile, end quote. Once the ruling was read, Gary Grant Sr. had what was described as an outburst in court, saying the following two things, which were reported by the Central New Jersey Home News. He screamed, quote, little maggot, and, quote, you let him walk out of here? Get out of my way. What are you going to do? Lock me up? End quote. I don't necessarily blame him for reacting in this way. Honestly, if it were my kid that was like brutally beaten and this was like the only person that...
I totally disagree with you, but continue.
Okay, but I think it's probably hard, like, to put yourself in his shoes and say, like, this is the only lead we've got. My kid was so viciously murdered. You probably have such an influx and overflow of emotion. Like, how hard would that be to keep it in? Even if, like, that side of your brain says, like, this confession doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense. It does not seem like he's the guy. You obviously want answers, and you're probably going to have, like, an overflow of emotion, and you're going to react. I mean...
Okay, why did he call him a little maggot?
That I have no idea.
What resentment does he have towards this kid? That is not like...
I think we're different.
To call him a little maggot.
Yeah.
It's okay to be upset. But to call a 12-year-old kid a little maggot, this 12-year-old kid that's supposedly afraid of his own shadow, that's like not something you say because you're upset. That's something you say because you fucking hate this person. Or you hate where this person comes from.
Yeah. I mean...
That's my opinion on it.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. I think just we are very different in our emotional reactions. Like sometimes I might just like say something I don't necessarily mean or, you know, have this overflow of emotion. I can understand that where I feel like you're like more, you can keep it in and you can keep your composure until you've really thought out exactly what you want to say. So for all we know, he just could have been like a really angry, emotional guy.
He's not mad at the judge's decision. He's not mad at the process. He's not mad that this kid's constitutional rights were violated when he's a fucking cop and his job is to uphold the Constitution, and he called the kid a maggot. That is not something you do because you're mad. That is something you do because you're mad and you hate the person that you're directing that to.
Is like maggot like a term that like you're...
Do you like maggots?
No, of course not.
When you call somebody a little maggot, are you trying to be nice to them? Are you trying to call them the scum of the earth? You fucking live in trash and eat garbage for a living.
Yes, but I just think back to like
That's a
he
bad
knows
name
how
to call somebody.
Absolutely brutally murdered his poor little 7-year-old son was. I mean, put yourself in that position too, though. Like, you just lost your freaking kid.
I get it.
And you didn't lose your kid by, a sickness or something you had anticipated. Like, you just saw your kid, and now he had his head bashed in by somebody. You're probably going to be fucking angry.
I absolutely agree with that. But reading that statement
Yeah.
and reading how everything went down, I don't know, man.
All right. Well, just to bring some levity here, I really enjoy the fact that you're now calling them senior and junior.
It's the easiest way to do it.
They're not Gary Sr. and Gary Jr. anymore. They are now junior.
It's just easier to say. And that way I don't have to remember Gary Jr., Gary Sr. I could just say junior and senior.
Yeah. All right. It's fine. Whatever works for you.
Yeah. But, I mean...
All right. Let's not
I don't want to keep going on that. And sure, I might be passing judgment because I don't know how I would react in that position. I understand I would be very mad and frustrated.
Yeah.
But you also need to be level-headed because if it's not going anywhere, you need to say to yourself, where do we go from here?
Yes. Well, there's a lot more, so let's keep going.
All right.
So because of Gary Sr.'s overflow of emotion in the courtroom, the judge actually stated that he would be waiting an additional day to release Boo from custody because I guess Boo's lawyer was worried about the things that Gary Sr. had said and that he thought they might have been threats against Boo. But it doesn't seem like anything came of this because the following day, February 24th, Boo Mason was released from custody to go back to live with his grandmother, but his trial date was still on, and it was still set for March 13th, 1984.
Why is he still going to trial?
It was just that the confession wasn't admissible. They weren't dropping charges.
If all they have is the confession and they have no physical evidence, what do they have? You
really don't like this one.
Well, are you kidding me? The only piece of evidence that have.
But wait, hold on. So at this point in the investigation, the confession, the one that we know is not admissible, it's being thrown out. It was the only thing authorities had, but
outside of the accounts of the two boys seen together.
But there wasn't a single other shred of evidence against him. Nothing. They had nothing to tie him. And
the judge said that they violated his constitutional rights.
I agree, yes. They were still going on with it, though. That's what these newspapers are saying. I'm telling you.
And then
charges were not dropped.
Boo could be filing a civil rights charge.
His grandmother wouldn't sit in on the confession. I don't think anybody's filing anything.
His defense
on that
lawyer,
side.
his defense attorney, should be like, we're countersuing for you violating our Fourth Amendment right.
So I did see some mention at some point about them potentially suing for what happened, but it doesn't seem like anything went anywhere with it. So I don't know if there were attempts made, exactly when those attempts were made. There were only a few brief mentions of it. So I don't know. I agree with you. I think it's,
right.
He was trampled over, like they said, but the whole thing at this point now is that authorities put out to the press.
So they're going to go to trial and they're going to be like, oh yeah, we have witnesses that saw the two together the day he died.
So obviously we know this is a setback. This is a huge setback for investigators and the prosecution. This is great for Boo's side of things, but authorities did tell the press, they did make it clear that they were still working to find evidence to try to tie Boo specifically to the crime. So they were still set on him. They still believed that he was involved. But there was mention that there was some other tip that they'd received that they were going to be looking into. And that tip was that on the day Gary Jr. didn't come home when he said he would, a blue van had been seen parked somewhere near that vacant lot where his body was later found. But nothing ever came of that, at least not publicly. So it seems like that lead led nowhere and they were probably still focusing on Boo. At the same time, though, that authorities were trying to find additional evidence to link the murder of Gary Grant Jr. to Boo Mason, the prosecution actually sent in an appeal to this ruling about the confession not being admissible. And they also requested that the trial be postponed until March 20th to allow time for the appeal process. However, it appears as though that process would take much longer than the week extension that was initially requested, because nothing regarding the appeal or the trial or anything was reported on until August of 1984, literally 5 months after the original trial date had been set. But the ruling came in on that appeal, and of course, it was unanimous. The appeals court found that the confession could not be used. Shocker. The court stated, quote, questioning a 12-year-old with an IQ of 65 all night long in the absence of any family member and faced with a series of accusations about inconsistent statements he had made can hardly be deemed non-custodial interrogation, end quote.
At least that's good.
Yes.
That's their final judgment even after an appeal.
But wait.
Another appeal comes.
No, the prosecution just could not let it go because they tried to get the frickin' Supreme Court involved.
Yeah, because that's all they had.
Yeah. And the Supreme Court
was like,
nah, we're not even looking at this.
Which is why it should have been dismissed.
From the get-go.
Once that confession was deemed inadmissible,
yeah,
the charges should have been dismissed.
Agreed. But at this point in the investigation, I mean, honestly, it was unclear if Boo was even going to be going to trial. I mean, charges weren't dropped, but there was still nothing to link him. All the appeal processes weren't working in the prosecution's favor. I mean, what were they going to do? And then finally, 4 months go by, and in December of 1984, the charges against Boo Mason were finally dropped. However, they were dropped without prejudice, which means if investigators were able to find additional evidence to tie him to the case later,
they could charge him again.
Pretty fucking wild, right?
I don't know how it goes with dismissing without prejudice.
Yeah.
But, like, you can't go through this whole process and then, appeal again, really try to go after this kid.
Yeah.
And say that you had no prejudice.
Yeah.
So, like, if the judge would have any say over this, I would say, no, you're not if you're dismissing this, you're dismissing it because you have nothing to go on.
Yes.
You can't just dismiss without prejudice to hope that you can come with more stuff later to fucking stick to this kid.
Yeah.
You should have waited to charge him until you had more valid evidence. Mm-hmm. And you shouldn't have violated his civil rights.
Yeah. It's just crazy.
So, it's a fucked up situation. And to go back with Senior, it's a very fucked up situation for him too.
Yeah. So I will say, so it's like we were just talking about all of this with him, but there's not a lot reported about what he's going through and what he's dealing with at the time. So, like, who knows what he's been seeing or what he's been told by investigators working the case, because he's obviously not working the case. So you're like, what is he being fed that would also make him that much more angry?
He's not working the case on the record.
Correct, yeah.
You can't say that any father that would have this happen to their child, or any parent that would have this happen to their child, wouldn't be working their own type of investigation.
Okay, well, let's keep going, because there's an interesting little tidbit I'm about to tell you. It's like we always get into this right when I'm about to add it in, so we'll just talk about it now. So about another year went by after the charges were dropped, and there wasn't really any movement in the case, and now we're at about the 2-year anniversary of Gary Grant's murder. At this point, Gary Sr. appeared to be pretty fed up with what he believed to be a lack of movement in his son's case. So he wanted to be the one to investigate it full time. And strangely enough, he was actually granted permission to do so by his supervisor.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
I think that a lot of times people would say that you're too close to the investigation, because then how these police went after Boo, the second that he has something, and this may not be accurate, but you would assume that the second that he has something potentially linking his son's murder to somebody else, he's going to go as hard as possible to try and pin it on that person and to really, go after them because he's blinded by the emotion of, this happened to my son, I need to find who did it. So sometimes your mind can start telling you what you want to know or what you want to believe to be true because you want the end result.
Yes, I totally see what you're saying, but you are surprisingly off base here. So
I'm not saying that that's what Senior would do. I'm saying a lot of times you wouldn't be allowed to investigate the murder of your child
because of that. Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, right. I'm not saying that that's what Senior would do. I'm saying that's why a lot of times people would refuse to allow that to happen.
I understand. Okay, so Gary Sr. was granted permission, and it was reported that he could work the case during his normal shift. He could track down leads, he could talk to witnesses, he could talk to anyone that might know something, but he wasn't allowed to question potential suspects. That was like a hard cutoff. Now, like you were just saying, it does kind of seem like this could be a conflict of interest, even though Gary Sr. stated that he would, quote, be careful not to do anything that might cause the case to be thrown out of court if a suspect is arrested and tried, end quote.
I totally get that. Yes,
Absolutely.
And that's why when you had said I was off base, not talking about what he would do, I could see from his perspective, because if he thought that Boo was responsible and then he has this outburst in court and it ends up getting thrown out and shit, he doesn't want to have that happen again because of, a lack of due diligence or violating the rules.
Absolutely.
Because if he ends up finding the real person that did this, because of him not following protocol, it gets thrown out, he's going to be in an even worse mental place than he was when Boo's got dismissed.
Yes, exactly. So at some point, the prosecutor's office did find out that Gary was going to be working on his son's case, and they really didn't like what was going on. But, I mean, even with that, Gary Sr. was still granted permission, and that was in January of 1986, so literally just about 2 years since Gary had been murdered.
I'm surprised that was allowed just by a supervisor. I'm surprised that doesn't have to go, up multiple levels.
I mean, maybe what if it was the chief? Maybe it was the chief considered, his supervisor.
Right, but the prosecution is for the police.
Yeah, I don't know. It didn't have to go through them.
So they're saying, I don't like that. They don't want to prosecute a case where the murdered's father was the one investigating it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I get it. I just don't know what protocol was back then. I mean, it's almost 40 years ago.
Yeah, and we also talk about how prosecutors and AGs and stuff only want to prosecute things that they know they're going to win sometimes.
Well, I mean, shit, they went up to the freaking Supreme Court with the appeal. Clearly they wanted to close the case on him, but now they're like...
They don't want another black mark on their record.
Yeah, so...
Because of something else out of their control. So if they can be like, no, don't let him do it.
Yeah,
I don't want to deal with the shitstorm that might come of it.
Absolutely, yeah.
You can read the headlines now. Father of slain child appointed lead investigator of murder investigation. People are going to be like, oh my God.
I can't believe they're doing that.
Right.
Well, there were a few articles. I mean, I don't think they were that catchy of headlines, but there were a few that were reporting on this and saying oh, yep, he was granted permission. Now he's working on it, blah, blah, blah. But the interesting thing, and why I said before that you were off base if you thought that it was Gary Sr. acting this way, even though that's not what you meant, but he wasn't zoned in on Boo Mason anymore. He wasn't Boo's the guy. That's not really where he was at. He believed, at this point anyway, that an adult killed his son. And a couple of the things that he goes back to, the first being that statement that Gary Jr. made to his mother before he left on the 12th. The fact that he said he had an appointment. Why would he use that phrasing or terminology? Seems a little weird.
What year was Amy Mahalovic?
Oh, my, 1990.
Okay. So this didn't happen prior. This case happened prior, but I'm thinking if he kind of made the same connection, because when you're in law enforcement, you hear about these types of things kind of from the...
Who knows? There could have been other cases like that he had known about that had happened in the 60s or 70s that he was, familiar with. But at the end of the day, it seems like an adult could have potentially told Gary, we're going to meet, we're going to have this 2:30 appointment. And then, like we said before, maybe they met, maybe they hung out for a couple hours, then something happened later, who knows? But based on what was reported on this whole scenario, Gary Sr. still didn't totally cross Boo off the list, but he told the Courier News, quote, "I don't think he did it, but I'm almost sure he was there. How long can he keep that in?" End quote.
Why does he believe that Boo was there? If
that
Boo was told by another witness.
I'm not entirely sure. I don't know what they know that we don't know.
Something else I was just thinking of as far as an autopsy and manner of death and narrowing down the type of person that could have done this. If he had strangle marks on his neck, Junior that is, you would assume that they'd be able to gauge the size of the hands and the amount of pressure put on with those. So I wonder if that was put out in the autopsy.
Maybe, yeah.
And maybe that's why he's now leaning towards
Boo
an
just
adult
being there, but an adult doing it. Yeah, there's probably things that have come out. It didn't seem like they were releasing really much else in terms of nothing about the murder weapon, nothing about DNA, nothing like that. So I don't know what else they had, but they're not saying it.
Well, now to go back on what I had said before about, Senior having something against Boo. Maybe he already was aware of the fact that Boo was probably there at the time of death. And maybe that's why the maggot name came out.
Yeah.
Because he's like, I know you were there. You might not go down for the murder, but you're, a piece of shit because you know something and you're not telling anybody.
Yeah, definitely.
So maybe that's why. Not necessarily because of Boo's family and stuff around that.
Just to say, we've got something to
we
say.
know that you were there at the time and you're not saying anything. Then I could see why he would have that hatred or that malice towards
resentment.
him.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's something else that happened that I haven't told you about yet. And it seems to be not only a pretty big clue in the case, but also might have been the reason why Gary's supervisor was more willing to let him work the case. You see, on January 4th, 1986, just a few weeks before the 2-year anniversary of Gary Jr.'s murder, there was a threatening and cryptic message written on a police cruiser. The message stated, quote, "Gary Grant is dead, but I'm alive. Another one will die on January 12th, 1986, if it goes right," end quote. First of all, it was believed that this message was written by an adult. So that kind of goes back to another point of why Gary Sr. was thinking probably an adult that killed his son.
Yeah, this is a fucking crazy person writing that.
Absolutely.
Like a wannabe Zodiac, like leaving hints and messages and shit.
For sure. And second, nothing actually came of the threatening message. Nobody was killed. There was no indication that a murder was ever planned.
Because it didn't go right.
That's true.
Because
That's a
whatever,
good point.
I mean, he didn't say that they were definitely going to die.
Yeah.
If it goes right, they're going to die. So
yeah.
maybe the planning, getting the child, if it was supposed to be another child, to come with them and to meet up with them at a certain time. His plan didn't go right. That's why.
Yep.
Another didn't get killed.
Yeah. Well, I have a photo of the cruiser. It's hard to read, like you can't quite read it, but I will put it on our socials in case anyone wants to see. And John, I just sent it to you.
Does it have a signature at the bottom right? Does that look like an R.I.?
No, that's right. If all goes right. It's like kind of written down. Okay. Yeah, towards the bottom.
It also says, so this is a quote here on the back driver's side door. Mm-hmm. But also up at the top right, under what looks like the cruiser number, there's also something else written up there. So I'm wondering if there was a ton of writing along this cruiser.
Yep.
And this is the one that they're honing in on because it was a direct threat.
Yeah. Rather than like maybe other. But then you have to think too, like, why are you writing all this on a car? Like, why are you rambling like that? Like, I think it makes sense that it would be an adult at the end of the day, but.
Yeah, it's somebody that, is living off the thrill of their crime.
Yeah, absolutely.
And loves the fact that they're still free and everybody's still looking for them. And now they're like egging them on like, hey, Gary Jr.'s dead. I'm still alive. Mm-hmm. I'm going to go after somebody else and you still don't know who the fuck I am.
Well, a short time later, another message showed up, this time written in wet cement. The second message was described in the Unsolved Mysteries episode on this case, as well as the write-up on their site. And the message reads as follows, quote, "Gary Grant Jr. lives. I still killed him. Son of a pig officer. Payback is a MF," end quote.
It must be somebody that Senior arrested. That's where I'm going with it already. Okay,
so that's exactly where I was just about to go with it. So my thought is this the motive now?
I think so. I think Payback is a motherfucker. Mm-hmm. They're paying Senior back. They went and they killed Junior for Senior arresting them. So you need to go back and you need to look at the arrest records of everybody that Senior had arrested, and there's your list to begin your interviewing process. Yep.
So I also will have a photo of that message as well. On our socials, and then I sent it to you too.
So this says Grant Jr. lives?
Yeah, isn't that weird?
That is weird.
Gary Grant Jr. lives, I still killed him.
Son of a pig officer. Payback is a what?
MF.
MF. That's what I thought you had said.
Yeah.
Yeah,
just
I mean,
the
you have to go
for motherfucker, but.
Right. So you now have two pieces of evidence with penmanship on them. Mm-hmm. One probably done with a finger.
Yep.
But definitely. Still close enough. Then you have another that looks like it was probably done with a permanent marker. Mm-hmm. If it's somebody that you've arrested and charged, generally they have to sign paperwork.
Mm-hmm. Could you check there?
A signature is usually different than printed writing.
Yeah.
But if some people that were arrested never learned how to do cursive, sometimes they just write their name.
Yep.
So you can look back at arrest records and you can see if they wrote anything. If you arrested people and they confessed to something and they did a written confession or they did a witness statement or anything like that, you have those that you can look back and you can use to try and match up the penmanship there.
Yeah.
But just knowing that this appears to be someone that Senior either arrested or was involved in the investigation of, and it's probably a bad person.
Yeah, definitely. And this is probably another reason why he's not zoned in on Boo.
Yes, and to go along with that, if it's not someone he arrested, could it be the significant other, friend, or relative of someone he put away for a long time?
Yeah, definitely possible.
So those are the types of connections I'd be looking into now.
Yeah, well, even with this new angle to work and things for him to now look into, roughly 2 months after Gary Sr. had began investigating the case and these mysterious messages, he was removed from the assignment because the prosecutor's office actually got involved at that point, and they made like this big old stink about it and called him working on the case inappropriate. Which
is what I would agree with based on what I had said earlier.
Yeah.
When you thought I was saying that that's what Senior would do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's too close.
And it makes sense, but I can also see Gary Sr.'s side of things. And he actually did something that I didn't realize was like a thing that you could do. And I don't know if it was like reported on wrong or if this is something that you've ever heard of, but he charged the prosecutor's office and claimed that they weren't looking into any of the leads that he'd provided to them in his son's case. And I mean, we know he couldn't interview suspects and he kind of had his hands tied a little bit in those terms. But now he's saying that he's not happy with how they, meaning the prosecutor's office, was like handling what he was giving to them. And the Asbury Park Press reported, quote, Detective Gary Grant Sr., an 11-and-a-half-year veteran of the Atlantic City Police Force, said yesterday that he outlined 11 instances in which he said the county prosecutor's office failed to pursue leads he developed, end quote.
Well, when he was named an investigator on this case, or appointed as an investigator on this case,
yeah,
and they gave pushback initially, they already didn't want anything to do with it.
Yeah.
So now, as he's providing leads for them to go after, or to interview, or to look into, they already stated they want nothing to do with it. So they're going to try and avoid it as best as possible until maybe they can get their ducks in a row, and they can get him removed from the investigation.
Mm-hmm.
So if they had gone forward with one of the leads that he provided without somebody else looking into them kind of unbiasedly, they would have to deal with the fact of, well, this came from the father of the slain boy.
Yeah.
When you go through the trial process of it.
Yeah, that's true.
So I can totally see the prosecution not wanting to go after it. Is that like dereliction of duty?
Mm-hmm.
Probably.
Maybe,
I mean, if Senior's doing everything right by the book because he doesn't want to have another instance where something is thrown out, like with Boo, they have to look into it. So I don't know what they would be charged with. So interested to see if anything came from that.
Nothing came from it. That's literally what I was just about to get to. It said that they, quote, found no basis on the charges, and the Daily Journal reported on like the response they gave. It said, quote, "We have reviewed this report by Barber and find that it satisfactorily responds to each allegation. The matter is still under investigation, and we are proceeding with the investigation, tracing leads as they may develop," end quote.
Well, then what I would say is, if Senior is now removed from the investigation, he passes on all of the leads that he had been working to the new investigator. They go through and do their thing. And then if they find that they also believe that it's something that should be followed up on, they pass them forward. And then if the prosecution is still not going forward with it, then maybe you have more of a basis to say, hey, they're not doing their job now. You now have two people that have put forward these leads to work, or charges maybe that they were looking to go forward with on these people.
Yeah.
And the prosecution has refused to do it for both.
Yes.
Why?
Yeah, it makes sense. But from there, years passed by, and honestly, the only real update in the case was the Unsolved Mysteries episode that aired in 1993, but nothing really came out of that broadcasting. And from there, we're actually going to fast forward about 22 years. Gary Grant Jr.'s murder case had been cold for over 2 decades, with no real movement at all, until 2015, when additional evidence was uncovered that may help to lead investigators and Gary Sr. towards the killer. Now, I don't exactly know how or why Gary Sr. was still investigating or involved in the investigation on the case, whether that was in a more official capacity or just kind of like on the side. But around this time, in 2015, he was working on converting old tapes to MP3s and stumbled upon 2 particular 911 calls of interest.
Even if he wasn't working in an official capacity, because now if he was 11 years essentially 20 years prior, he'd now be a 30-plus year veteran of the police department.
Yeah.
Who knows how long he can be there, but a parent's or family member's investigation is never going to end.
Exactly.
You
It
look
just
at
makes me
Jerry
think
and
of,
Teresa's case.
That's exactly what I was just about to say. Yeah.
You know, it's never going to end for him, so he's always going to be investigating until he finds the person or...
Mm-hmm. I agree. So this first call, which I will play for you in just a second, came in on March 8th, 1986, over 2 years after Gary Jr. had been killed and was right around the same time that Gary Sr. had been taken off the case. This date would have also been Gary Jr.'s 10th birthday. All right, so I'll play the first call for you now.
Police and fire. Yes. Is it possible for me to collect a reward on my own self for the murder of Gary Grant?
Is it for you to collect a reward on for yourself? If you have information, what are you saying? That, I don't know what you mean. Like, if you know who did it or something like that, you mean?
No, well, how's if I did it myself and I want to collect the own reward?
If you did it?
Yeah.
Well, suppose I hook you into the Detective Bureau.
No, that's okay.
I mean, that's on the...
Make sure that, no, that's not a crank call. You never be able to catch him.
You know what?
You never be able to catch him.
So, first of all, if you couldn't quite make it out, the main part of this call is that the caller is asking if he could collect a reward on himself if he did this. And come to find out, the reward was around like $2,500 after donations and money Gary Sr. had come up with to offer. So, what are your thoughts?
I don't know what to think.
Yeah, that's tough, right?
This could be, just some whacked out person.
Mm-hmm.
This could be... I think that this could be the person who committed the crime.
Yeah.
Only because at the end, they're like, you'll never catch me.
Oh, yeah. And you can just tie that right back to like leaving the notes and all of that. Like it seems like that's I feel like it's promising. I feel like.
I agree. I was thinking at the beginning, can I confess to something and turn myself in? I was thinking it was going to be like a crazy big reward. And maybe if he, turned himself in, he would get that money and it would go to an account that a family member or a friend or somebody could have taken.
Yep.
But
that last bit.
No, that's like something out of a movie.
Mm-hmm.
That is, I feel like if I had to put my money on it, was that the killer calling? I would say yes.
Yeah. Well, then that's really important. And it's very important for our listeners because specifically, I think authorities want people to recognize the voice. And if you recognize whose voice that was, because he did not give a name, it doesn't seem like they know who this person was that called. So, if you recognize that person's voice, absolutely call in because as of today, there's like a $17,000 reward. So the reward's a lot more now. So,
yeah. Well, I'm thinking if this was a 911 call, even back in 86, they should have had a general idea of where that call came from.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder what they kind of did to follow up. Probably came from a payphone.
Wouldn't surprise me, yeah.
In the middle of wherever.
Mm-hmm.
But I would want to listen back to this multiple times.
And it almost sounded like they were driving.
It could have sounded like they were driving because it sounded like there was like a hustle and bustle
it's
around.
86, you didn't have cell phones, so that's weird. So maybe it was at a payphone.
Could have been people driving by.
Yeah.
It could have been on a pier. It could have been like if this was like near
City.
a beach or something like that.
Yeah.
Atlantic City still. That could have been wind blowing. That could have been the
boardwalk.
Beach. It could have been the beach coming in and
Yeah.
out. So
there's a lot of background noise.
There's a lot of background noise. I think that if you were to put this into like an editor and you could break down the sounds and hear different things.
Where's Penelope Garcia when you need her?
And enhance.
And then you zoom in on this super blurry photo and it's like the clearest, crispest picture.
Right. But I want to listen more to his accent.
Yeah, definitely.
He sounds like a person from the area, but it didn't sound like he had a Jersey accent.
No.
He sounded like Northeast, someone from this general region.
Yeah. Well, let's listen to the second 911 call, and then we can go back and we can kind of compare and contrast in a minute. So the second 911 call that Gary Sr. found while he was converting the tapes came in on June 2nd, 1986. So about 3 months after the first call came in. So we'll play that one for you now.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't give you my name, but I was just at Ellensburg, California, in Fairmount. Right?
California, Fairmount.
Right, Ellensburg.
Allen?
Right. This is the guy there named... I don't know. Well, I'm just saying, this is his name. on a minute. Hold on a minute. Don't hang up, okay?
So before you give your opinion, I just want to clarify a couple things because I think that one's a little bit harder to understand. So during this call, the individual does not give their own name, but they do appear to name someone, which it's bleeped out in the call. Well, kind of just like blanked out. You don't hear anything. And they're saying that this person allegedly confessed to the murder. And they're saying that this person that they're now naming, so a totally different person from the caller, but they're giving a name, said that they killed Gary Jr., quote, because of the father. And not only that, he mentions that they knew what he looked like, meaning the cops knew what he looked like. So they knew whoever this guy that this caller was naming.
Goes back to the writings.
Yeah.
On the cop car and on the and in the cement.
Mm-hmm.
Police probably know who this is because they arrested them.
Mm-hmm.
Gary Sr. was probably the one involved in arresting or involved in the investigation that got this person arrested. They have booking pictures.
Mm-hmm.
They know what he looks like. And it's obvious that the first caller is not the second caller.
Yes, but before you say anything else, I do have to tell you, Gary Sr. does know this person that was named in the call.
Of course he does. He probably...
But no, he said that he never had any issues with them. No problems with this person.
Problems with a family member, a friend?
It doesn't seem that way. If he's publicly putting out that he knew this person named and had no issues with him, it's a little weird.
Gary Sr. may see it as they had no issues with him.
But this person might have had issues with
This person could have seen something that Sr. did as a transgression against them.
Yes. So one more thing I want to make sure that you're aware of, too, while we kind of discuss these 911 calls, is, suspiciously enough, apparently the guy that was named in the call was arrested sometime between 2011 and 2013 for sexual contact with a young child as well as child endangerment. So clearly he's got some sort of bad history, but it's not really clear if that ties to anything related to Gary Sr. But I think that's still something kind of important to know.
There's also nothing saying that the second caller is being truthful.
Oh, absolutely not. No, you don't know. Some random person could just be calling in about Joe Schmo.
This guy...
Should we just call him that, Joe Schmo?
This second caller, maybe he knew who actually did it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not. That's inconsequential.
Yeah.
But maybe this person called and was trying to pin it on this other person that was named because maybe they're a pedophile.
Yeah.
They get charged with it later. Maybe he knew something was going on. Police didn't catch him. They didn't know what was going on. So maybe they tried to put the crosshairs on that person's head for police to go after them for the murder of Junior.
For sure.
Dialect-wise,
yeah,
this guy seemed... When investigating, you have to make judgments.
Yeah,
right?
Oh, of course.
This guy seemed not from the Jersey area, roughly, maybe a little further south.
Agreed.
Maybe he was Southern, moved up here. Maybe was Southern, was imprisoned up here, crossed paths with this person somehow. Mm-hmm. But it also seemed lower IQ.
Yes, I think the first guy...
I was thinking Boo's father, personally.
Okay,
I was like, if Boo is low IQ, most likely one or both of his parents were similar, unless there was some type of issue during birth and, drinking or something while she was pregnant. But perhaps there was a link there, just because Boo was low IQ and this person seemed to, from the drawl in their voice. And
well, I think, personally for me, just listening to both calls side by side like that again, because it's been a couple weeks since I've listened to them, that first call to me, he seems condescending and happy about what he's calling in about, and he wants to continue on with this charade with police and ooh, I'm gonna call in and I'm gonna say something and I'm gonna be I'm gonna taunt you.
Thinks
that's
they're
where
smarter than everybody else.
Yeah.
Probably well kept.
Yep. This other guy, the second call, seemed a little bit more to me maybe this person pissed him off. Maybe he didn't know for sure if he was involved in Gary Jr.'s murder, but he's oh yeah, he was joking around with me one time, so I'm just gonna fuck him over. I'm gonna call police. Just trying to be not overly serious about it. He's not calling in saying I know this guy and he did this horrible thing. He just kind of seemed like he was having a weird casual conversation with the 911 operator.
There are a lot of people that I've interacted with throughout my life and career where they may be lower IQ from like an intelligence standpoint, but their street smarts is like through the roof.
Mm-hmm.
So where I gauge it, it's the first person was like taunting police, probably well kept, thinks they're smarter than everybody else because they haven't been caught yet. And the second person knows their way around and probably, if he's talking about the first person, read this person and was just like, hey, you're a bad dude.
Bad dude, yeah.
Get out of here.
For me, I land with the second call probably being inconsequential. I feel like it might not really mean anything. He names this other person. Who knows if that's the person that called from the first call? You would probably assume authorities have looked into that. I think at the end of the day, that first 911 call is indicative of either somebody that did it or someone that was really close to who did it.
The first call, I think, is the killer.
Yeah.
And then I think that if the second call had been vetted, that's how I would have read the call.
Yeah, definitely. I think no matter what, at the end of the day, authorities put out these calls. They want to know who these callers are. Neither caller identified themselves. So it doesn't seem like police know who either caller is. The only person they've been able to really look into is the person the second caller named. So if you're listening and you recognize either of these voices, definitely call into authorities to even just give a name. I mean, they'll probably vet people before they even talk to them to see if there's any potential for involvement. Now, over the past few years, authorities have put out kind of what they label as their, quote, facts of the case, so that anyone looking into it can kind of review what police have gathered and, you know, the things that they're sure about so far. Plus, it kind of helps to not get confused with early reporting on cases like this, too, where you might be mixing up things that were known earlier on versus almost 40 years later. Like, where are police today is kind of what they're putting out. So I'll kind of go through them with you. First is the fact that on January 12th, 1984, Gary Grant Jr. left his house around noon, telling his mother, May, that he had an appointment to go to, but told her that he would be home for dinner. And that one kind of seems like it hasn't changed. So authorities are pretty dead set on that piece of the case. Second, when Gary didn't return home, his mother became concerned and not only searched the area, but she also spoke to two of his friends that he usually played with, and both of those children told May that Gary had actually been there hanging out with them, that he left their house no later than 4:30 p.m. to head home. So that's different. We were thinking earlier that maybe that 2:30 appointment could have had something to do with it, but if he'd already gone to said 2:30 appointment and then was hanging out with his friends down the street, that kind of makes me lead more towards something happened between his friend's house and home.
I'm wondering if this warehouse area where Junior was found after he was murdered, is that in between or is that a route home from his friend's house?
Good question. I'm not sure where the friend's house was, but I do know that the lot where he was found was only 2 blocks away from his house. So, I mean, you could assume it could have been, or it could have just been like an easy diversion, like taking him maybe from the friend's house they met and then went the opposite direction. Who knows?
Or if he was walking, he could have been abducted in the...
Like in an alleyway near?
Yeah, like kind of like in the middle of his route home. And perhaps those strangle marks on his neck were somebody keeping him quiet.
Maybe.
As they brought him over to the warehouse area where he was then murdered.
Yeah.
So.
The third thing is that May searched for over 2 hours before calling Gary Sr. He then took the night off of work. They searched until 2 a.m. and still hadn't found Gary. Along with that, the owner of the warehouse heard about Gary being missing and he came down to help search. And then finally, it's confirmed today that Gary Grant Jr. was in fact bludgeoned to death. So most of those things we already knew, but it is good to know that authorities haven't really veered off track with what they knew from the very beginning, that these are the facts that they've come up with of the case, these are the things they know for sure, and they're confident in them. So I think really the only thing that was different seemed to be the time frame in which he could have potentially been murdered.
Sure, now we know that it's more narrowed down to post 4:30.
Yeah, exactly. So we had been talking before about how the grandmother had allegedly refused to sit in, and that actually wasn't like posed that way, I guess, until more recently. And authorities have been, putting out these things to kind of clarify where they've been in their investigation over the years. And now today they're saying like she allegedly refused to sit in on the questioning. And I think they're probably trying to clarify that a little bit better to like say like why wasn't there an adult present?
Right. It's not like, oh, we just dragged this kid into the interrogation room.
Yeah, it's like we offered and she said no.
Right. So we can't not, interview him now. When in actuality, they shouldn't have. But they're like, hey, we threw out the offer and she refused. So we continued on.
Yeah. And authorities have in recent years also attempted to clarify like kind of what happened during the questioning, because obviously that seems to be a huge point of contention for people and for us to say, like, why was Boo questioned like this? Like, this is problematic. And I also say it in the term of attempted to clarify, because I don't really know if any of the original detectives who were directly involved in the interrogation are even around anymore. So you can't really ever know for sure exactly what happened, but it has been stated that Boo was brought in after authorities heard he'd been seen with Gary. So that was like the big thing where it's like you were asking why he was even brought in the first place. And it seems like that was like the biggest thing. And then they said because he supposedly began to implicate himself, that's where it's like, okay.
Sure, they brought him in because people saw that they were together, but you didn't have to bring him in at midnight.
Yeah,
You could have went and got him in the morning, and then he's allegedly implicating himself because he's privy to information because of this other witness.
Yes, so I just think it's hard, like I said, to know for sure. Like, obviously, they probably want to try and clear the air a little bit because it seems to be shrouded with this, not following protocol or, doing something that you technically shouldn't have done type of like air around it. But there's actually an article on the Press of Atlantic City's website, and it states, quote, "When Carl began to implicate himself, the interview was stopped and he was read his rights," Barber recalled. Carl's grandmother was also called in and given the opportunity to sit in, but refused, end quote. So they're saying that they read him his rights when he was supposed to, all of this stuff, but then you have to think, like, if what you were saying, if they're asking him about the crime, they're supposed to read him his rights beforehand. So then he was only read the rights when he started to implicate himself, or does that matter?
It's pretty gray right at that point, because
yeah, okay.
Once there's information that leads you to believe that you're going to go forward with charges,
okay,
that's when you should be reading them. But what it sounded like is earlier, since before they kind of rehashed what happened,
yes,
it sounded like they went pretty long into this.
Yeah.
And then
we're like,
once they kind of knew where it was going to be and what he was going to say and what he was going to put in for this confession, then they read him his rights and then they took the confession.
Yeah.
But it sounded like they had already laid the groundwork of what he was going to put in this confession prior to his Miranda rights being read.
Yes. So I think that's why now authorities are like, this is how it happened. This is what we did. We did things the way we were supposed to. But again, that just goes back to the same thing I said before.
And why isn't that what they said before?
Yeah, I don't know if Barber was one of the ones that was involved in this interrogation. Like, I don't know if he's just saying because, what is he, chief now? Like, he's a way up, I
don't know. I'm always skeptic.
But
I'm always a skeptic on everything. I say this all the time.
Yeah.
But when you're telling a story about how something really went down 40 years ago, and it's not what they had every opportunity to say 40 years ago, why should we believe you now when they could have put out the same statement back then?
Yeah.
And they didn't.
It's tough. I don't really know exactly, but...
Yeah, I wouldn't judge either way which one's true, but I'd lean more towards the statement that was put out 40 years ago because they had every opportunity to try and cover their tracks back then.
Absolutely.
To say that they did things right. And clearly whatever they put out was not enough for the judge to keep the confession in, and he ended up throwing it out. So.
Yeah, I think the thing about that too, though, is like, who was your chief back then? Like, who had the final say on those things? Like, did they lean a certain way in their beliefs on what they could release to the press or what they would be willing to tell the public? Like, maybe they were like, no, you're not saying anything about the way this confession went down. And now, 35 years later, whoever's in charge now, they're like, no, fuck that. I'm going to put that information out now so that people know. So I feel like you can look at it through multiple different lenses is all I'm trying to say.
And I agree with you. I understand what you're saying, but they had to present how they did this to the judge.
Yeah.
And whatever they presented was found to be...
not good.
Yeah.
The thing that's kind of interesting, too, is that some detectives, including Jim Barber, this was on, I believe, that Press of Atlantic City's website as well, he had originally worked the case, but again, I'm not entirely sure if he was a part of that interrogation, but he apparently still believes, at least as of 2015 when that article came out, that they actually had the right person when they arrested Boo. But then you think, like, now you've got these 911 calls, you've got these cryptic messages on the cruiser and the wet cement, you've got all these things that lean towards, like, this probably being an adult. Like, what could make you go back to Boo? Like, what else do they know then? Or is it just like you're dead set in your belief and it's like, I thought it was him from the beginning, so I still think it's him now?
Well, he's had decades to go after Boo, and they were allowed to dismiss charges without prejudice. So if they came across something, they could have charged him again.
Yeah.
And for the fact that they haven't charged him for almost 4 decades now, when they have all the opportunity they want to do so, I would say, show me what you have that leads you to believe that.
Yeah. You know what else is interesting, too? Boo was actually in the Unsolved Mysteries episode. They interviewed him.
And what did you think about him?
I think he seemed pretty normal. Like, he just kind of seemed maybe a little naive. Like, he got totally railroaded. And, you know, I was impressed that he went on national television to, you know, talk about kind of what went down. And I don't know.
He must have been close to 20 at that time, right?
Yeah, he was 21.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think, not that we're really, I feel like we kind of like talk about theories as we go throughout these episodes, but I don't think Boo did it. Like, if a worst case scenario, maybe he was there, maybe he witnessed something he shouldn't have, someone yelled at him to get out of the area and he saw more than he should have. But, like, I really don't think that he had any involvement here.
I think that you can't come to the conclusion that he did it because there's no evidence saying that he did. The prosecution went forward with everything they had, which all it was were witness accounts saying that the 2 boys were seen together, Boo and Junior, and an allegedly coerced confession, followed by decades of no additional charges after the originals were dismissed without prejudice.
Yeah.
What can you say, or how can you say that it was him?
Yeah.
With no evidence.
With no physical evidence either. Like, this is a super, like, it's almost like all hearsay.
Yeah. I mean, so many people were probably at that murder scene that had kids that were probably talking about it. Other people overheard. So even though nothing was put out in the news, back in the 80s, word spread. You had no social media. The news was on once or twice a day. People talked. Word of mouth was the way that everything was passed on. Somebody probably heard. Somebody told him. It was probably the talk of the town, especially in, like, the kids groups. Like, once one person said something about it, it probably spread like wildfire.
Yeah.
And he got stuck because he knew a little bit, told police what he knew, and then it kind of snowballed out of control. At the very beginning of the episode, I said I think it was an adult just based on the murder weapon.
Yep. Well, yeah, that was a huge thing that I feel like we didn't even touch on when we were talking about, like, how the lawyer said, like, he didn't know if his client was capable of this, and, you know, talking about, like, his physicality. Like, he was smaller than Gary.
He was smaller than Gary. It was a 1-foot pipe. How thick was this pipe? How heavy was this pipe?
He's 12 years old. Is he going to be able to ferociously hurt, like, beat this kid so hard?
He's not going to be able to choke him. If he's a smaller kid, you know, Junior's going to fight him off. You're not going to bash somebody's head in and then choke him to death. The choking probably happened during the course of bringing Gary Jr. to the spot where he was murdered, and then he was, you know, killed with the pipe and bludgeoned to death. Just from the very beginning, I didn't think a child, let alone a smaller child than Junior, doing this.
Yeah, I totally agree. And honestly, that's kind of where the case stands today. There hasn't been anything put out super recently in terms of where the investigation stands, other than, like, those facts that have been reported on. And I know we kind of go through, like I was literally just saying, like, theories throughout as we talk about the different aspects of the case that come up, and whether it was an adult, whether it's a person that ended up being charged, blah, blah, blah. So something new that I wanted to start implementing in the episodes, which is something John had done back in the Lila Poitras episode, was kind of like a questions we're left with section rather than like a theories section, because we already talk about that. So we'll kind of put together like a list of questions we feel like we're left with. And then, you know, if you guys wanted to comment on YouTube or on Instagram or whatever, like, did our questions align with yours? Are there things that you're more interested in knowing that we didn't touch on? So, you know, I kind of have my number one question more than anything out of all of this is, what the heck is up with the murder weapon?
Yeah.
That's my number one.
My only concern with the murder weapon is that if it was in January, maybe the person that killed Junior was wearing gloves.
Yeah.
And maybe there's no DNA evidence or anything on there. But
could there be fiber evidence, like fiber from gloves or...
Could there be, yeah. I mean, we're talking, what, 84?
Mm-hmm.
Just on the cusp of that type of evidence
Yeah.
really being a thing.
You still hear about people collecting it, though, at least.
Yeah.
So
I would say, if there was still snow in the area and it hadn't all melted, were there boot prints?
did Gary fight back? Did he
How big
scratch
was
his
this?
assailant?
Yep. How big was this carpet that was dragged over him? Because you're also thinking, okay, could a very small child beat another child with this metal pipe? Is that possible? What are the, choking marks on Junior's neck consistent with? Like, can you measure the size of a hand? Would a smaller child be able to create that kind of bruising or damage to the neck?
Yep.
Was this a giant carpet that a small 12-year-old wouldn't be able to drag?
No, it was not, because they had mentioned before that his mittens and I think his feet too were peeking out from underneath it.
So it was like
I
a
think
scrap.
It was small. Yeah, probably.
It was like a scrap of carpet.
Yep.
Okay.
Cross that off the questions we're left with.
Right. So I guess the question that comes out of this is, would a smaller child than what Junior was be capable of doing this?
Would even a child in general, regardless, like even if he was a normal, like an average-sized 12-year-old, could someone of that size do that? I mean, that to break through skull.
Well, I mean, you have skulls shattered everywhere.
Crazy force, yeah.
Right, you have skulls shattered, you have blood spatter. It's not like he got hit over the head and knocked out and ended up dying because of his head, the back of his head hit something when he fell to the ground.
Well, then that makes me think, like, I don't know if anybody listening has watched Candy on Hulu, but if you haven't, spoilers ahead because I'm about to go over some things. But that was like a big thing in that case was she like hit her with an axe like 40 something times.
Right.
And it's like, is that possible? And like her husband went, and I don't know if this is true, if this was dramatized for the show, but like he went out and like took an axe and smashed a trunk of a tree over and over and over and over again. And it like took everything out of him. But with enough adrenaline, could you do it?
Yeah.
Like those are the things that I wonder. And it's like, I don't know.
We talk about cases where there are like, what was the case with 27 stab wounds?
Stacey Burns,
right? To do that motion that many times, it's...
And you counted it out in that episode. So it's like, that's only like 10 of them. I think I only counted
to 10, right?
Yeah.
To do it that many times.
And that just felt so long and so...
vicious.
Yeah. It's like, how could a 12-year-old be that angry?
Yeah. So the question that comes from this portion is, would Boo have been capable?
Yeah.
I lean towards no.
I lean towards no, too.
Okay. What's your next question?
Next question just kind of has to do with that first caller. Are police aware in any way, shape, or form where the call came from? If the person was local, do they have any leads on who it might have been? Even if they have a list of 20 people that they're considering and they're waiting for the public to say like, oh, I recognize that voice, or...
My question to go along with that would be, did police record an interview with the named person from the second call and compare it to the first call?
Yep.
I would assume probably. And then with Senior saying that the person that was named by the second caller, he had no issues with them, could he have done something that person could have seen as a transgression towards them? Because some people are fucking tapped. He could have been a politician going around shaking everybody's hand, and this person could have been so hard up, oh, I want to meet him, I want to shake his hand, and he passed over and didn't shake his hand and went to shake everybody else's. Like, you've seen stuff in media and shit where people just snap like that, and they're like, oh my God. Like freaking Stan from Eminem writing the letters and shit, and then it goes fucking nuts. So it could have been something like that where Gary Sr. had no idea that this guy held this hatred towards him or resentment. Yeah, it's like...
Could have been the silliest of things.
Right. Did they have a rough geolocation of where that first 911 call came from? I'd want to know that.
Yep.
Were they able to bring in some type of specialist to compare the writings from...
That's what I was just about to go into next.
The car and the cement. Were they the same?
Yep.
It might be hard because one's probably, like I said, who knows? It could have been... The cement could have been done with some type of instrument, or it could have been done with a finger.
Yeah, but I feel like writing down versus writing sideways, like up against the cop car versus down on the ground.
Yeah, true.
I think those two ways of writing can change how you like how your penmanship comes out.
Yeah.
But
what other questions you have?
those are really the big ones that I had.
My only other thing, again, would be going through arrest records, because if Payback is a motherfucker, if that, there's also the chance that this was just some asshole going around writing these things, having nothing to do with the murder. They're just trying to get off on the thing.
Yeah, but when you add it all together and then you lump it in with that 911 call to say, like, you'll never catch me.
Right.
Like, all this stuff that was written really coincides with that pompous attitude that that individual had on the call. So I think combining all that, it makes you think, like, is this really some fucking weirdo just doing it? Or is this someone who's, like, proud of what they did and they're flaunting it?
Yeah, I mean, it just has to be said that it could have nothing to do with it.
Of course.
But on a scale of things, yes, my scale would tip towards the person that called, could be the person that wrote it, could be the person that killed Gary Jr.
Yeah, I completely agree. So with all that being said, as of today, there's a new DA working the case, Damon Tyner. Come to find out, Tyner actually knew Gary Jr. and Gary Sr. back when the crime first took place, and that's because Tyner actually played basketball for Gary Sr. back in 1984. Remember, I'd mentioned that he'd been a volunteer basketball coach for the other school at that time.
Something just popped into my head.
Tell me.
Did he not play someone's son?
Oh my God,
on a basketball team?
It's such a stupid thing, but like you were just saying about like the whole not shaking someone's hand, like it could be like, why are you fucking my kid over? Payback's an MF.
And I got goosebumps when that popped into my head. I was like, I totally forgot about the basketball thing.
Yeah.
And I was like, holy shit, he was the coach of this team.
Yep.
My son deserved to play. He made my son sit the bench or whatever. I'm going after yours.
Hey, I mean,
could seem outlandish, but if Gary Sr. said, I know this person, I have no problems with them, that's something that could go,
it could be
unnoticed.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't even put two and two together there. That's a good point. But anyway, it appears that Gary Sr. is thrilled that Tyner is working on his son's case, and he told Breaking AC the following, quote, "It does my heart good to see that there's some activity with the investigation. That is all I have ever asked for since the beginning. I felt deep down inside that when Damon Tyner went into that office, something would finally be done. My hat's off to you, Mr. Prosecutor. Now I can only pray that with the new technology available today, that was not available in the past, there just might be a break in the case." If you know who made either of those 911 calls from 1986 or have any information regarding who killed Gary Grant Jr., please contact the Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office at 609-909-7800 or contact the Atlantic County Prosecutor's Major Crimes Unit at 609-909-7666. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.